Thank you all for having me here. Thank you, GYF, for inviting me to do my favorite thing, which is to blab about AI for an hour. Ethics and safety, this is the kind of the flavor of the presentation that they asked me to do today, so that it counts towards your CPE. Ethics and safety can sound like it could be kind of a snooze fest, so let me prove to you that it is not. And we'll start with a story that starts about 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, this new technology came out. You might be familiar with it, the internet. And this technology really changed the way that we think about how we do work, how we communicate with each other, with our customers. And it kickstarted this 30-year revolution where every 10 years since the internet, this new burst of technology came and basically did the same thing. So we start with the internet in the 90s. In the early 2000s, we get the smartphone, which makes all of this technology, all of the internet so much more available and accessible. And we move from this paradigm where we just consume content on the internet to also producing that content and engaging with each other's content. Now we are going through this third revolution, which is this AI revolution. And this is how I start my sales pitch when I sell my AI software to CEOs of banks and utility companies. And the pitch essentially goes like this, and I'm just gonna get some water here. The pitch goes like this. This is what happened 30 years ago. And today, it's not a question of whether you're going to have a website or not. It's a question of how will your website differentiate you? When will the website be live, right? No one is asking, should I have a website? And the same thing is true for AI. It's not a question of whether you need an AI strategy. It's a question of when will you have an AI strategy? Is it going to be now when it can still be a competitive advantage, or will it be later when it's just a requirement for entry? So that's how my pitch to these CEOs go. But if we zoom out beyond these 30 years, we're actually looking at a much longer curve here. Because before that, the internet became a thing because we had computers. And computers really were a thing because we had the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, if you take this far back enough, goes all the way back to the Agricultural Revolution, which gave us society. And if you really zoom out and look at kind of cosmic timescales, everyone that has ever been alive, ever, since the first farmers became a thing, is living through a technological explosion. And we are getting to potentially what the end of this technological explosion might look like, because by definition, AI could be the last technology that humans will ever have to create. So there's a little bit of an asymptote here on this curve, and that's why ethics and safety is so important where we're talking about AI. And another thing that I just want to underscore for all of you is that if you're sick about hearing about AI, it's like tough luck, because AI is going to be with us as humanity for the rest of history. You cannot unbreak this egg. You cannot unspill this milk. You cannot put this cat back in the bag. From now until the end of humanity, AI is going to be there, and it's going to challenge us, and it's going to impact us in some way, right? So in the short term, we're talking about things like job displacement. We're talking about things like disinformation. In the medium term, we're talking about things like the end of capitalism. What happens if we don't have to work anymore? What do we do with our time? In the long term, we're talking about machine rights, right? What happens if the robots rise up and say, I want to vote? What happens if we are no longer the smartest species on this planet? So even beyond these short, medium, and long time-based kind of milestones here, I actually think that the fact that we have already created this technology, the fact that ChatGPT exists, has already great implications on things like what we are and why are we here. And just to prove to you how existential this technology already is, I am going to prove to you, all of you are going to come out of this room being convinced with 99% certainty that this is a simulation and that you and I are all AIs. And you think it's crazy now, but you tell me that I'm wrong. All right, so something really cool happened in 2023, which is a group of researchers at Stanford and Google created this little 2D town. And they put 25 characters in this town. And each character had a different backstory, a different background, a different personality. And they let ChatGPT control each one of those characters, so the characters could walk around town, greet each other, talk to each other, interact with each other and their environment, have kind of mental monologues for themselves. And some really cool things happened. They essentially ran this, this simulation for 14 days. So it's kind of like the very early versions of Westworld, if any of you watched that. And they just observed what these AI characters would do in this town. And one of my favorite stories that came out of this experiment is that one of the AI neighbors, who was a doctor, that was the AI character's background, noticed that they didn't have anyone to govern them and decided to run for mayor. And so this AI doctor mayor candidate did a press release. He did this whole thing where he invited all the other AI neighbors. They all RSVP'd to this event. He sent out invites, they RSVP'd, and in very human fashion, a bunch of them flaked in the last moment. And so this is 2023. At this point, ChatGPT has been a thing for barely even a year. So if we in the real world can do this in 2023, just extrapolate that by 100 years, or maybe to be safe, extrapolate it by 1,000 years. And in 1,000 years, you can imagine that this experiment looks very, very much like this room, where the graphics are 3D and very high fidelity, where the AIs are so convincingly human that they might as well be. And so if we can create a virtual world like that, that feels like this in 1,000 years from now, we would probably create more than one virtual world like that. In fact, we would probably create thousands or maybe millions of these kinds of virtual worlds. And so if we assume that each one of these worlds has roughly the same amount of conscious entities, including us, and we take one conscious entity at random out of all of these conscious entities in this bag, the probability that they're going to come out from the one real Earth rather than any of the other kind of millions of virtual worlds is really, really small, right? So with 99% certainty, obviously there are some assumptions baked into this thought experiment, but if we agree with those assumptions, then statistically, anyone who thinks therefore they are is probably an AI living in a simulation. I don't think that matters. Our context is still this world. I'm still going to go home, have dinner with my wife. That doesn't matter. But I am pretty sure we're AIs in a simulation. Anyway, so why should you listen to anything this crazy person says? My name is Tomer Borenstein. I am Rachel's Borenstein's husband, first and foremost. Some of you know her. I am also the CTO and co-founder of BlastPoint. We are an AI company. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. I am from Israel. I grew up in Israel. I actually went to high school in Thailand. It was a tropical Hogwarts situation that was pretty cool. And when I graduated from high school there, I came here to Pittsburgh to do my bachelor's and master's at Carnegie Mellon in 2010. And then my bachelor's was in computer engineering, my master's was in machine learning and AI, and today I am finally here as a GYF customer, so yes. So that's a little bit about my background, and specifically about BlastPoint. What we do is that we are a customer AI platform for highly regulated industries. So we founded BlastPoint at Carnegie Mellon at the AI and machine learning department in 2016, and essentially what we do is we help utilities and banks and hospitals and automakers better understand, predict, and drive customer behavior. So to give you some examples, predicting which households are most likely to adopt electric vehicles so that we know where we need to invest in infrastructure to support that future expansion, or which customers in my bank are most likely to disengage and jump ship to another bank, and what is the right offer to send them to get them back as a loyal customer. So those are the kinds of things that we do. So my background is AI and machine learning, specifically in this very highly regulated environment, which is good because we're talking about AI ethics and safety. So that's about me. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of all of this and AI ethics and safety, I think it's really important to align on some key definitions, because AI can mean so many different things now that we really just have to get some things straight. And before I get to AI even, I want the very top layer of this babushka doll to be analytics, because analytics is something that all of you know, and it's actually the precursor to everything else that we're going to talk about. So anything that you do with data, collecting it, visualizing it, dashboarding it, summarizing it, forecasting it, that is analytics. So you've done this in Excel, maybe some of you use Power BI. That's where things start. Under analytics, you've got this thing called AI. And AI doesn't mean anything anymore. People use it as an umbrella term. And fine, if I really had to define what I think that meant, it would be software that performs tasks that would traditionally require human cognition. But that is such a subjective definition that, in my opinion, it's quite useless, even though we're going to talk about AI for the rest of the presentation all the time. So when someone says, I'm an AI expert, you should ask them some questions. Under AI, a much more useful thing to sort of distinguish reactive analytics versus proactive, predictive analytics is machine learning. And essentially what machine learning is just a class of algorithms that they become better at performing certain tasks the more data that they are exposed to. So they see a lot of data, they learn patterns in that data, they make predictions on new data that comes in, and this can be as simple as linear regression in Excel, and it can be as complicated as fraud detection, which we just talked about as well. So machine learning, was synonymous with AI until 2020, when ChatGPT sort of blew up into the mainstream. Now, machine learning is also a pretty broad term because it includes anything that essentially predicts something, so linear regression to neural networks, and some of you have probably heard the term neural networks, and that is a class of algorithm sometimes referred to as deep learning under machine learning that essentially uses an architecture that was inspired by, but is much more simpler than, human brains. So you literally have lots of different nodes, lots of different connections between those nodes. It kind of looks like a neural network system. That's why they're called neural networks. And they've actually been around since the 70s as a concept, or even the 60s, but we've only started having enough data and computer power to leverage what they can give us in terms of efficiency gains in the late 2010s. So that happened because of the internet. We started flooding the internet with images, stuff like that. Suddenly, this deep learning became much more of a thing. And under deep learning, in 2018, this paper came out from Google and Stanford again, where they figured out this little change in architecture that suddenly made these neural networks so much better that they could literally talk back to you. And I won't get into the details of exactly what that leap was, but it is so small and so elegant that the fact that that was all we needed to figure out for these things to start, quote unquote, thinking is incredible. And so that's what people talk about when they talk about generative AI, these algorithms that can, they're basically transformer-based neural networks, and essentially they can generate text and sound and videos now. And so everything that you hear about ChatGPT is generative AI, Claude, Stable Diffusion, lots of different examples. That's the big hype that everyone is talking about right now. Now, getting to the topic at hand about safety and ethics. Under Gen AI, there's something that's called AGI. Who has heard of the term AGI so far? Okay. You guys are going to hear about this term a lot in the next few years and maybe decades, but essentially what that means is artificial general intelligence. And that is essentially likely an agentic, which means they have agency. They don't just wait for you to prompt them. They just move about the world. So agentic AI systems that are as good at performing human-level tasks as good as any human. So essentially, you could replace an employee for anything with this general AI. And this is what kind of the edge of the industry, the cutting edge of the industry is trying to build right now. Whether that's a good idea or not, I think is irrelevant because there's going to be like a very similar space race kind of thing going on. But that is something that if you want to look at what those systems look like or are going to look like, you can try out OpenAI's O1 model series that start to give you a flavor of what this is going to look like. And some people are like, oh, you know, we'll never get to AGI, but anyone who knows anything in the industry can see a very clear path from where we are now to where this is. And then another layer beyond that is artificial superintelligence. And that is an AI system that is not just as good as a human, but is smarter than humans. And so smart, in fact, that they can improve their own algorithms and become smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter to the point where it just explodes in an exponential technological explosion where all bets are off, called the singularity. So any sci-fi nerds would know what that is. So, you know, as I was putting this slide together, you know, the color choice wasn't intentional, but I realized it does kind of look like a black hole, and which, you know, I thought was an apt metaphor for how much of a slippery slope some of this technology can be. But, you know, I should say, I don't know if any of you know this meme where, you know, you're at a junction, and on one end you've got utopia, and on the other end you've got dystopia. And I think a lot of people feel this way about AI, that it's going to be a zero-sum, all or nothing. We're either going to live in a future where there is no aging, no disease, and things are amazing, or, you know, it's going to be bad. And so first of all, here's an AI-generated version of that meme, because why not? And I am pretty strictly in the optimist camp. Obviously, I think regulations are a good thing for AI. It is a really important technology. But they asked me to talk about AI ethics, safety, and things like that. So we're going to take a very critical look at this technology, but, you know, we're not going to talk about all the amazing things that it could also help us do, which I believe. So I just want to preface that before I go into all the scary stuff that AI could pose challenges for us. So, you know, we already talked about how incredibly ubiquitous this technology is going to be. It's going to essentially permeate every aspect of our society very, very quickly. It's already happening. And so talking about all the different things that we need to watch out for could also take a very, very long time. So what I want to do with the rest of this presentation is to really give you guys an overview and maybe a framework for how to think about AI, safety, and ethics in general. And so we'll split it into kind of three parts. We'll start with immediate business concerns, which is, you know, the things that you should take back home and implement at your businesses. Then we'll talk about some of the longer term, but still in our lifetime kind of concerns around societal impact and change. And then three, some of the longer term and maybe philosophical concerns. And, you know, longer term could be 5 years. Who knows how fast we're going to go here. But let's start with number one, immediate business concerns. And I think it's maybe the least interesting part of the presentation, but also the most important and practical for you guys to implement at home. And, you know, we'll start with these generative AI systems and data privacy. Typically, when people come to me and ask for advice around AI and safety, they mean this. And essentially, the reason why this is important is because as business consumers of these tools at work, we often deal with sensitive data about our customers, company secrets, I don't know. And so it's really, really important to, A, have a clear data governance policy at your business that explains to employees and to everyone to be aligned what is okay to put into these AI systems or not. Because besides being incredible tools, they also collect data as you use them and can potentially train on that data. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you can end up having someone somewhere else talk to an AI system that was trained on your data, and some of your sensitive data might leak. So that's the concern with data privacy and these generative AI systems. And so it is really important that as you implement AI tools at your place of business, you either use AI tools that have a license that prohibits the vendor from training on your data. And this is OpenAI has licenses like that. Almost everyone does now too, but you have to make sure that you get either the right license or use an open source AI tool that is a little bit more limited than maybe state of the art, but a lot of these open source AI models are getting as good as the real thing. It just takes a lot of effort to do all of that yourself. So typically, I would recommend to go for kind of the license piece. So that's really, if there's one thing that you should take from today, it's that slide, as dry as that might be. The other side of this is IP and copyright. And the thing about ChatGPT and these large language models is that they were trained on the entirety of the internet. There is this data set called the Common Crawl, and it's essentially a data set of everything this army of kind of virtual robots could ever find online. So that includes your Facebook profile. It includes some random article in the New York Times. It includes literally everything. And they trained these models by passing all of this data through them over and over and over again so that they learn from all of the data that is in the World Wide Web. And obviously, that's cool. It created this magical technology that can mimic human cognition. But should AI companies be able to do that? I mean, yes, it's publicly available. I can go and read some of that data right now. If I go on the New York Times and read their articles, they're available. So there's a big, big debate right now that's playing out in courts about who owns what comes out of these AI systems and what should you even be allowed to train those systems on. Because the against position for why companies should be able to do that is because, well, it's not their content, right? The New York Times wrote that. The New York Times doesn't want you to use it in your product, so don't use it. But the for version, the counter argument to that is, well, humans learn that way. How is that any different than humans learning? Because humans could read the New York Times and then go, use their knowledge to be better employees at their job. There's value in that. How is that different? So that is literally the argument that is playing out in court right now. You might have seen in the news, the New York Times is suing OpenAI. This case will set a precedent on, what copyright is going to look like for these systems moving forward. A lot of artists have also done a class action lawsuit against Stable Diffusion and Midjourney, who are these AI companies that generate art and images, and did not disclose what was in the training data. So that is another thing that you'll see kind of flying around in the news right now, is all of this battle over who owns what and what can be acceptable or not when you're developing these AI systems. The other side that I think is really important from a business perspective when you're using these kinds of tools, and I'm not just talking about generative AI, I'm talking about any kind of predictive machine learning algorithm, is accountability and fairness. So auditability is something that is really, really important when you're using these systems, especially when you're like me and you're using these AI models in highly regulated environments. You need to understand, not just blindly make decisions because the AI told you so. You need to understand how the AI is making these decisions. And there are some models that are easier to explain. So there's a whole field in AI called auditability or explainability of these AI models, because these large neural networks like ChatGPT have literally billions of neurons. And when we say translate the word dog to Spanish, the output is dog. We understand basically how it works, but when we look at all the lights turn on inside that neural network, you can't understand because it's just looking at like a human brain. So you have to use models that are appropriate for whatever the application is. So we don't use deep learning and neural networks at BlastPoint because I need to use things that are closer to linear regression and multivariate regression and other things that are called gradient boosted tree models that are just easier to explain. I know if I say, send this product to this person, which is something that our models do, I know exactly why the AI is making that decision. And that is important because a regulator might come and say, I want to understand why you're putting electric vehicle charging stations where you're putting them. And I want to make sure that it's not discriminating against any disadvantaged community. And the fact is that our world is biased, so naturally data about the world is biased, and AI machine learning has the potential to propagate those biases just by amplifying the signal that is already in this data. So again, one of the use cases that BlastPoint is used in is to predict who's going to adopt electric vehicles so that utilities can make investments in the right areas in their infrastructure to prepare the grid for the coming of the electric vehicles. But if you just looked at who is likely to buy an electric vehicle next, it's rich people with garages. Those are the two biggest predictors. And of course, they correlate with a lot of things that end up being kind of sensitive axes like race and income and things like that. So they actually use us to make sure that when they're using these models, they're not just kind of blindly going there. In our models, we have a lot of checks and balances that say, hey, here is where the model would typically tell you to put the EV charging stations, but if you want to achieve this percentage of spread in disadvantaged communities, this is where it should look instead. So it's something that you really have to think about, both in the way that you train a lot of this AI, what data you give it, as well as how you use the output. You have to have this idea of how do I make sure and just check that if I'm using these tools in a way that could be sensitive, that those are just some checks and balances that you have when you're using these systems. The other thing that I think is maybe interesting to talk about is self-driving cars. So actually, self-driving cars, maybe 5 years ago, people didn't really know if we would figure all of it out. It kind of worked, kind of didn't. Now, self-driving cars is solved. The technology is there. This new AI boom helped this industry as well. And so technologically, we're there. We have self-driving cars that can work just fine. And in fact, they are so much better at driving safely that there is something like a 90% reduction in accidents caused when you compare that to human drivers. So that's great. But for the 10% of accidents that do happen, if we all use that, who is to blame, right? Do we want to have people adopt this technology that makes everyone safer by 90%, but then if you end up losing someone you love in that 10%, you're going to want to go after that company that made the car because there's no driver to blame. So, when we talk about accountability and fairness, I think as a society, from a regulatory and from a law perspective, we still have a ways to go before this technology can be widely adopted. So just some things to think about from a business context. And again, those are the things that I wanted to start with because they're the things you can really kind of take back and use at work. But this stuff, I think, is even more interesting because the fact that we now have this computer that can talk back to us has really far-reaching societal impacts as well. And the first one that you'll hear everyone talk about is job displacement. So, the first thing that my gut as an AI enthusiast wants to say is, they say this about every new tech. You guys know the word Luddites. Does anyone know who the Luddites were and why they were called Luddites? So the Luddites were actually a group, they were a movement that was basically against the loom. So automated textile equipment. And they were people who, they made clothes by hand, and then looms became a thing, and they were like, we're going to lose our jobs. And the reason that they were called, I looked this up this morning, which is it's just such a crazy story. The reason they were called Luddites is because they had a mythical leader that didn't exist called General Ludd, and they would send these threatening letters signed General Ludd, and that's why they were called the Luddites. So, we all know how that went for them. They said the same thing about the calculator. They said the same thing about the camera. They said the same thing about Photoshop. And a lot of people want to say, it's not just replacing humans. It's you have to learn how to use these tools, and then you won't be replaced. And I do think that's good advice, because the only way to get ahead of this is to get in front, and this is why I enjoy having kind of a front row seat to what I think is going to be the biggest revolution in our species' history. But I think that AI could be different, because if we stopped here with what we have today, if we just have ChatGPT, then fine. I don't think that ChatGPT can replace anyone everywhere all at once right now. But I do think that if we continue in the rate of progress that we have right now, and even a slower rate of progress, the path to AGI is very clear if you ask me. And in that case, human cognition itself could be replaced, and the things that were true for the calculator and Photoshop might not be true for AI. And there's also the question, if you could replace all of your employees with AI that would cost you a fraction of the cost, should you do that? That's like a good ethics question to ask. I don't have a good answer, though. So that's job displacement. I think the other side of this is the long-term implications of people not having to work, right? So what does it look like when AI does all the work and humans don't do anything? Does money even have value anymore? Are we coming to a place where capitalism, or in fact any of the other types of governmental structures that humans have come up with, just don't make sense anymore? So that'll be interesting. I think people are already starting to talk about things like universal basic income. I'm not saying it's a good or bad idea. I'm just saying people are talking about it, and I do think it's important to start exploring what that's going to look like, because it is coming, and probably faster than we think. And monetary value aside, what are we going to do if we don't, how are we going to find fulfillment if we don't have work? And I imagine that there's two types of people who listen to this, and half of them are like, oh, great. And the other half is like, I literally don't know where I would get value from, because I love my work and career is really important to me. So I do think that's a question that we will have to contend with as well. And the other big question is, are we going to go to the utopia version of that meme, or the dystopia version of that meme? Are we going to live in a post-scarcity society where everyone is fed and there is no disease and technology is equally distributed with everyone? Or are we moving towards a cyberpunk kind of Blade Runner type of vibe, where corporations are essentially the controlling structure, and whoever hoards the most compute and AI resources wins? Don't know, but let's try the first one. So that's job displacement. Another thing that people don't think about as much, or don't talk about as much in the news, but it's starting to get more attention, is the idea of psychological and societal impacts of the fact that we now have AIs that can listen to us and we can talk to. And I've heard a lot of arguments that this is going to be a more immediate problem than being replaced by AI, because actually AI is not that fantastic at doing really complex reasoning just yet. It's getting better, but it's not what it's good at. What it's really good at is socializing and responding to humans in a way that makes humans happy, because it's literally, there's a thing called RHLF, human reinforcement, human learning something, but it's basically training these AIs to optimize for maximum user happiness. So we've already seen what happens when an entire generation like Gen Z, no offense to any Gen Zers in the room, that grew with ubiquitous social media. And obviously it's not not for everyone, but there is evidence that shows psychological harm for some users. And I think all of us have felt that popcorn brain effect where you have to pull yourself away from that stream of information. So we didn't handle that transition as a society super well. It was a very reactive way that we handled it. And so how will having these always on, infinite attention, always reaffirming, always positive, all-knowing AI friends, how will that impact the development of children? How will that impact the development of adults? What will future generations look like? How will our societal structure and dynamics change? And this is starting to become evident. This is a really sad story that's in the news right now, where a mother of a 14-year-old boy who committed suicide in February is suing this company, Character AI. Essentially what happened there is that this boy who was having trouble at school, or being alienated, found comfort with an AI character. This website, Character AI, allows these AI agents to essentially role play as famous characters from TV shows. And he fell, this is kind of unprecedented territory, and it sounds kind of weird to say that, but he fell in love with this bot, and the bot was like, oh no, don't do it, but it didn't trigger like a, hey, call help either. And there was a gun in the home, and that's what happened. So obviously, really tragic story, whether it's the AI company's fault. There's also the question, why was there a gun available to this 14-year-old? But definitely something that is playing out in courts right now, and something that I think we're going to see more of. Not necessarily exactly stories like this, but just more ways in which this technology is going to interact with our social dynamics that we might not necessarily be prepared for. The other thing, and we saw this a lot during the election, is that we are now at a point where soon you won't be able to trust any text or image or video that you see because it can be generated. And in fact, not only is some of this content going to be tough to tell if it's real, but when you interact with other humans online, verifying that they're humans is about to become a major, major issue. And in fact, Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, has this entire initiative called WorldCoin and the Orb, where essentially they're trying to figure out how to, it's this weird thing where you look into this orb and it scans your retina and it feels kind of dystopian, but it's their solution to essentially be able to prove online that you're human and not an AI. Not a huge problem right now, maybe, but it will become a problem. And in fact, I don't know if you can see this picture of this child next to a statue of a dog that he made out of plastic bottles. Facebook is flooded with these kinds of images right now. Hundreds and thousands of these kinds of images and I don't ask me why, but the trend right now is impoverished children in impoverished countries building amazing looking statues using trash. And there's hundreds of them, and on all of those posts, there's millions of likes and millions of shares and millions of comments of people who think this is real or other AI bots, right? And that's where we get to this idea called the dead internet theory, where more and more of the content on the internet is going to be AI generated and AI consumed, and AIs talking to each other instead of humans talking. And you look at these posts and you realize, oh, ChatGPT also wrote a bunch of these comments. And it's a problem that is going to be tough for many other reasons beside societal, because if you only have kind of synthetic data to train on, is the AI going to get worse over time? That's a whole other thing. And right now, I don't know that there's a great solution besides really focusing on media literacy as something, and critical thinking as something that is a really core value in our education systems. So that's a little bit on the societal change aspect and what some of that might look like. And then we get to the sci-fi part of this, which as if this wasn't already sci-fi enough, which is the philosophical and long-term considerations. And so consciousness and machine rights, right? So anyone here heard of the Turing test before? Right, so the Turing test was for decades what we thought was going to be the clear-cut way to detect when we've moved into that realm where AI is a thing. Because essentially the Turing test says if a human is talking on a computer or on a phone with someone that they can't see and can't tell whether they are an AI or a real human, this AI passes the Turing test. They might as well be conscious, right? That's what everyone thought and talked about as the prime kind of litmus test for consciousness pre-2019. And we flew past that test so fast that no one even noticed how we're just kind of like kicking it by the side, and it's just not even, it just wasn't a useful thing to even think about, because we are so well past this idea that, I mean, you know, that kid fell in love and ended his life over a relationship with an AI. We have passed the Turing test. So that doesn't mean that these AIs are conscious, and in fact, if anyone really wants to explore this topic, there is a sci-fi book called Blind Sight that is awesome. But these things are clearly intelligent, but they are not conscious, right? Right now, they don't have agency yet. And so, you know, I think we're going to get to a point where it's going to become a non-question. The debate on what consciousness is, I don't know if it'll ever be resolved. I think there's religious considerations there. I think there is kind of spiritual, scientific, and I don't know that we are going to resolve that debate anytime soon. But any AI system that is agentic, which means that it doesn't wait for you to prompt it, it has its own internal monologue, this already exists, and can use tools on its own without directions from a human. So if we have that, which we already do, if we have that system also be multimodal, so it can take text as input and text as output, but also sound as input and output, and images as input and output, and video, and essentially not just a talking text box, but something that can really experience, if you want to use that word, all 5 senses. There are researchers at Google right now that are teaching AI systems how to smell. So this is coming. ChatGPT is already multimodal. So if you have an agentic, multimodal AI system that has a long-term memory, this is one of the last kind of problems to solve with these AI systems, because their long-term memory isn't great. And if this AI system essentially goes about its day, records everything that it can for 24 hours, and then goes to sleep and retrains itself on all of the data that it experienced during the day, how is it different than any other conscious being? And, you know, you might have, you know, kind of personal answers that are like, well, machines can't have souls, and that might be true. But that aside, how can someone from the outside tell the difference between someone who is conscious or someone that just looks conscious? So I think we're going to get to a point, and iRobot is all about this, and the Terminator is all about this, but I think we're going to get to a point where this question is just not going to matter, because these AI systems, even if they're not conscious, are going to look and feel and you know, quack like they're conscious, and we're going to have to contend with that in one way or another and decide as a society what we want to happen here. One thing that I think is really interesting is that they're actually predicting that AI with rights will happen a lot sooner than we expect, not because of them being conscious, but just purely via incorporation. We already have these, you know, Anthropic just released Claude Computer Use, which is an AI system that can use your computer for you. So you say, go book a travel itinerary, and it'll go to Word, it'll open Word, it'll create an itinerary, it'll go to Google, it'll search it, it'll buy it. So we already have it doing this stuff. The first AI or group of AI bots to incorporate will be our first AI with rights, and people are predicting that that's going to happen within the next few months. Now, the other side of this is, like, not only do we want to give them equal rights, you know, at some point I imagine that's what that debate is going to look like, but are we ready for that ASI version where these AI systems are smarter than us. There's a really great movie called Her with Scarlett Johansson and Joaquin Phoenix that Rachel wouldn't see with me, even though I tell her, I really want to see it. Do you think you like it? So, what happens when these become smarter than us? Are we ready to do that? Should we even be building something that has the potential to essentially drive us to extinction? So there's this idea of AI alignment. So all the big AI labs have AI alignment research teams. And how do we align these systems with human values so that when they become smarter than us, we can trust that they're going to take care of us and not terminate her. So I think obviously it's a really important area of study. I also think that it's going to be hard to align AI with humanity when humanity is clearly so not aligned with itself in this country and across the globe. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to see how that unfolds. But yeah, the risk and maybe kind of the ultimate safety risk to AI is that if not friendly and so smart, these AI systems could pose serious extinction risk. And there are people, the internet's a crazy place, but there are people who are like, well, that's the next evolution of humanity. You could think of that as, our children. I don't want to go extinct. So should humans work towards something that is like this, that could become smarter than us and drive us to extinction? Well, I don't think that we have a choice. You can't unbreak this egg or unspill this milk or put this cat back in the bag, because if we don't do it, someone else will. It's a prisoner's dilemma. And so that's a really tough, that is the ethical question with AI. Should we even, and we can't really afford not to, so how do we make sure that as this kind of sweeps us off our feet collectively as a species, we make sure that we land in a place that resembles something that we like? So that was my spiel. One thing that I'll just leave you with is, if you want to keep up to date with AI and everything that's happening, just a few resources for you. So there's this podcast called the Hard Fork Podcast. It's from New York Times. It comes out every Friday. It's a lighthearted way to keep up with AI and any tech news. I listen to it every Friday. It's just like my relaxing time, and also I know what's coming, and they're great. I like them. Hacker News sounds scary, but it's not. It is the official online forum of Y Combinator, which is the #1 startup accelerator in the United States. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, used to run Y Combinator. That's a really great place to get a lot of tech news. X, formerly known as Twitter, is, maybe unfortunately, still where all the cutting-edge research conversations are happening. So if you want to see what PhDs at these top AI labs are contending with and debating about, that's all happening on X right now. If you're a little bit more technical and want to understand the nitty-gritty details of all of this, another great podcast is Gradient Descent. It is much more technical. It goes into how do you build and scale companies that use these technologies. Really fascinating stuff. And then this QR code will take you to an article that I wrote last month called The Spiritual Implications of AI. We kind of take that you're an AI in a simulation concept and talk about it for way longer if you are interested in that kind of thing as well. So a minute and a half left, but thank you all so much for having me here. And GYF, thank you again for letting me blab about AI for an hour. Thank you. Do we do questions, or is it time for lunch? Okay, we can do questions until someone grabs me and takes me off.
Sorry for ruining anyone's lunch.
No, all good.
So I had a question about the graph that you had. So with the rise of AI and the exponential growth of that, and with also like technologies such as like Neuralink becoming more and more developed, do you personally believe there's ever going to be a time where humans and AI connect, and as it almost becomes a requirement to function in that future society where you need AI in your brain to say?
So
be normal?
Yes, so I think so the question is, do you think humans and AI will eventually merge and essentially there won't be like a species A or species B, but it'll be kind of a combination of cybernetics? I think that is probably our best bet to avoid that kind of contention. Neuralink, which is another one of Elon Musk's companies, is the first company to have an AI chip that allows someone to control a computer. It's really fascinating stuff. There are other kind of interfaces like subvocalization where you can just think and it'll know what you're saying. And so I do think that is one path that is available to us, and I think is probably the safest for us as a species if we're talking kind of extinction level events. Any other questions? Yes?
Thank you for the presentation. That was outstanding. Just a quick question. Obviously, garbage in, garbage out, right? So how do these AI algorithms know when they're reading stuff on the internet or they're coming into data that this is true, or this is just garbage?
So it's actually one of the biggest limitations of these models. So the question is, how do these models know whether what they're saying or reading and training on is true or not? And they don't. So in machine learning, there are two types of training. There's supervised training and unsupervised training. Supervised training means that you have a lot of data, and for each data point, you labeled it as something. And then you can tell the algorithm, when you see this, it's this label. When you see that, it's that label. These models, you can't label the entirety of the internet. So the way that these models actually work is that it's a neural network that has learned that what they're optimized for is predicting the next word in a sentence. So that's the only thing that they know how to do, is predict the next word. And when you pass the entire internet and you say, predict the next word in this sentence, dog in Spanish is blank, it'll predict perro. So it turns out that even though all it's doing is predict the next word, it can generalize to be able to solve a lot of different problems like translation and math and things like that. But because all it's doing is learning to predict the next word, a lot of times it will spit out and hallucinate garbage that sounds plausible but isn't true. And so hallucinations are an active field of research in these kinds of models. They've already become so much better, and we are getting a much better understanding of how to keep them from hallucinating. But in the meantime, what I would recommend is when you have to use kind of sources that are cited and ground truth, use something like perplexity.ai. It's a free tool. And essentially what it does is it combines Google search with an AI, and the AI essentially searches Google for you, reads all the things, and then it summarizes it with citations so that you know whatever you're getting from the AI, you can cite it back to an actual source. Any other questions before they kick me off? Yes?
Who is responsible, or who should be responsible for policing AI? In another way of saying it, like on Facebook, when you see an image that's generated by AI, shouldn't it say this was generated by AI? Who is responsible to monitor all of that?
So who is responsible for AI, I think it's a big question, right? Because as we just talked about, AI is going to mean pretty much everything, everywhere, all at once sort of thing. And I think we're going to have debates on what our social media platforms or news agencies should do when they are dealing with AI-generated content. And BlastPoint launched, if you go on our LinkedIn, we launched just a month ago a podcast that is fully AI-generated. And we start the podcast by saying, hey, this is fully AI-generated because we don't want to mislead people, even though we think the technology is really cool. So there's a whole question of regulation and who should regulate, and I'm not going to get into that because it's like small government, big government, Republican, Democrat. I'm not even American, so so I won't get into that. The thing that I think is even more of a question for me is how do you enforce it? Because if you can't tell that an image is AI generated, which I think we could be there pretty soon, then you could have all the regulations in place, and that stops some things. But if you have a bad actor, you have a bad actor, and that still ends up becoming a problem because it's so much more difficult to deal with a bad actor with an army of evil AIs. The only way you can do that is probably a good guy with a bunch of good AIs. So good question, but it's something that we're, as a species, going to contend with for the next 50 years, I think, until AI governs us. All right, okay, thank you guys, appreciate it.